The bridge railing bit into his palms. Wind whipped his face. One step and it would all be over. But then, a voice. Warm. Steady. "Hey, man. Can we talk?" Keanu Reeves stood there, eyes locked on the desperate soul before him. This wasn't a movie. No script, no second takes. Just two men, the abyss, and a chance to change everything. The bridge loomed before Keanu, a concrete giant stretching into the darkness. His footsteps echoed in the night, each one amplified by the eerie stillness. Something caught his eye, a distant figure, barely visible in the gloom. Keanu's pace slowed, his instincts prickling with unease. As he drew closer, the scene unfolded with horrifying clarity. A man stood on the bridge's edge, his body swaying precariously over the abyss below. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a late-night walk anymore. It had become a desperate race against time. The air grew thick with tension, pressing down on Keanu like a physical weight. His mind raced, searching for the right words, the perfect approach. One misstep could send the stranger plummeting into the void. Keanu's own battles with darkness rose to the surface, memories of loss and loneliness threatening to overwhelm him. He inched forward, hands raised in a gesture of peace. The stranger's eyes, wild with fear and pain, locked onto Keanu's. In that moment, a connection sparked between them, two souls teetering on the edge of oblivion. "Hey, man," Keanu called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" The words hung in the air, fragile as spun glass. Keanu held his breath, watching for any reaction. The man's grip on the railing loosened ever so slightly, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. Keanu's heart thundered in his chest. He knew the statistics, the grim reality of bridge-related suicide attempts. But behind those numbers were real people, each one fighting their own internal war. He couldn't let this man become another statistic. Drawing on every ounce of empathy he possessed, Keanu continued to speak. His tone remained calm and steady, a lifeline in the chaos. "I'm here to listen," he said, taking another careful step forward. "Whatever you're going through, you don't have to face it alone." The night seemed to hold its breath. Traffic had long since faded away, leaving only the whisper of wind and the distant lapping of water. In this suspended moment, two strangers stood connected by a thread of fragile hope. Keanu's mind raced with everything he'd learned about crisis intervention. He knew that his presence alone, his willingness to listen, could make all the difference. But the wrong word, a sudden movement, anything could shatter this tenuous connection. The man on the ledge trembled, tears glinting in the dim light. Keanu's own eyes stung with empathy. He thought of all the times he'd felt lost, all the moments when the world seemed too heavy to bear. But he'd found his way back from that darkness. Now it was his turn to be the light for someone else. The silence stretched between them, a chasm deeper than the abyss below. Keanu's heart raced as he gazed into the stranger's eyes, recognizing the familiar glint of despair. The man's voice cracked, raw with pain. "Why should I keep living? Nobody cares." Keanu's mind whirled, searching for the right words. Every syllable could tip the balance between life and death. He thought of River, of Ava, of Jennifer, the ghosts that haunted his own darkest hours. The weight of their absence pressed against his chest, threatening to steal his breath. "I care," Keanu said softly, his voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind. "And I understand feeling like nobody does." The man's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Keanu fought the urge to rush forward, knowing a sudden movement could shatter this fragile moment. Instead, he inched closer, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I've stood where you're standing," Keanu continued, his words carried on a trembling breath. "Not on this bridge, but on the edge of giving up. I've lost people I loved, my best friend, my daughter, my partner. Each time it felt like the world had ended, but I was still here, alone in the wreckage." The man turned slightly, curiosity flickering in his tear-filled eyes. Keanu's pulse quickened. Was this the lifeline they both needed? "There were days I couldn't see a way forward," Keanu admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm here now, talking to you, because someone reached out to me in those moments. They reminded me that pain connects us all, even when we feel most alone." The stranger's grip on the railing loosened almost imperceptibly. Keanu's words seemed to hover in the air between them, a fragile bridge spanning the darkness. "I'm listening," the man whispered, his gaze meeting Keanu's fully for the first time. Keanu exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. He thought of the research he'd read, about how shared experiences could create powerful connections in crisis situations. Here, on this bridge, that theory was being put to the ultimate test. Your pain is real, Keanu said, his voice gaining strength. But it doesn't have to be the end of your story. We can face this darkness together, find a way through it. Will you let me help you? The man's shoulders sagged, as if a great burden was slowly lifting. He nodded, almost imperceptibly at first, then with more certainty. That nod opened a floodgate. The man's story poured out, a torrent of heartbreak and hopelessness that threatened to sweep them both over the edge. Keanu steadied himself, his eyes never leaving the stranger's face. Each word carried the weight of a lifetime's pain, and Keanu felt it settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. I lost everything, the man choked out, his voice raw with emotion. My job, my family, my reason to wake up in the morning. It's all gone. Keanu nodded, his expression a mirror of the man's anguish. I hear you, he said softly, the words carrying more than just acknowledgement. They were a lifeline, a testament that the man's pain was seen, felt, and understood. Your pain is real. The wind whipped around them, carrying the faint scent of rain. Keanu took another careful step closer, close enough now to see the man's trembling hands gripping the railing. The distance between them had shrunk, but the chasm of despair still yawned wide. Tell me more, Keanu urged gently, his voice steady and warm against the chill of the night. I'm here to listen. The man's eyes, wild with a storm of emotions, locked onto Keanu's. Why bother? He spat, bitterness dripping from every word. Nothing can bring them back. Nothing can make this right. Keanu felt the weight of his own losses pressing down, threatening to overwhelm him, but he pushed back against the darkness, drawing strength from the very pain they shared. You're right, he said, his voice low but firm. Nothing can bring them back. But that doesn't mean your story ends here. The man's breathing hitched, a mix of surprise and uncertainty crossing his face. Keanu pressed on, seizing the moment of connection. I've stood where you're standing, he admitted, the words tearing from somewhere deep inside him. Not on this bridge, but in that place where the pain feels endless and the future looks impossible. A flicker of recognition passed between them. The man's grip on the railing loosened ever so slightly. How? He whispered, the single word carrying a universe of questions. Keanu took a deep breath, steeling himself for the memories that rose unbidden. I've lost people I loved, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My best friend, my daughter, my partner. Each time it felt like the world had ended. The man's eyes widened, a hint of something other than despair creeping in. Keanu recognized it for what it was, a fragile, newborn hope. He nurtured it carefully with his next words. There were days I couldn't see a way forward, Keanu continued, his gaze never wavering. But someone reached out to me in those darkest moments. They listened, really listened, just like I'm listening to you now. The man's breathing slowed, his posture shifting ever so slightly away from the edge. How did you keep going? He asked, that flicker of hope growing stronger in his voice. Keanu extended his hand, palm up, bridging the final gap between them. One day at a time, he said softly. Together. The distance between them shrank, not just physically but emotionally. The man's eyes, still brimming with pain, now held something else, a spark of connection, of understanding. Keanu felt it too, a shared language of loss and resilience. It's not about forgetting, Keanu said, his voice gaining strength. It's about finding meaning, even in the darkest moments. For me, it was about honoring the love I had, the memories we shared. The man's hand twitched, inching away from the railing. I don't know if I can, he whispered, fear and longing warring in his voice. Keanu nodded, acknowledging the enormity of the challenge. It's not easy, he admitted. But you don't have to do it alone. There are people who want to help, who understand what you're going through. A single tear traced its way down the man's cheek, glinting in the dim light. Keanu resisted the urge to reach out and wipe it away, knowing that this moment of vulnerability was crucial. Tell me about them, Keanu said gently, inviting the man to share more of his story. The people you've lost. What made them special? For a moment, the only sound was the distant rush of water below. Then, slowly, haltingly, the man began to speak. He talked about his wife's laugh, his daughter's fierce determination, the way his father's eyes crinkled when he smiled. With each memory shared, the man's voice grew stronger, more present. Keanu listened intently, nodding and offering soft words of understanding. He reflected back what he heard, not just the words, but the emotions behind them. "It sounds like they brought so much joy to your life," he said, his voice thick with empathy. The man nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time. "They did," he whispered. "God, I miss them so much." "That love doesn't go away," Keanu said, his hand still extended. "It's a part of you now. Always." The man looked at Keanu's outstretched hand, then back at his face. The internal struggle was visible, hope warring with despair. Keanu held his breath, knowing that this moment balanced on a knife's edge. Time seemed to freeze, the world narrowing to a single point. Keanu's outstretched hand hung in the air, a lifeline in the darkness. The man's fingers twitched, inching closer, then retreating. Hope and despair waged war in his eyes. Keanu's heart thundered, but his voice remained steady, a beacon cutting through the night. "I'm here for you," Keanu said softly, echoing the words of countless crisis counselors before him. "You're not alone in this." The wind whipped around them, carrying away his words, but the man's gaze remained locked on Keanu's face. Keanu took a breath, steadying himself. He knew that in moments like these, raw honesty could bridge the chasm between life and death. "I've stood where you're standing," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not on this bridge, but in that darkness where it feels like there's no way out." The man's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition cutting through the haze of despair. Keanu pressed on, sharing a story he rarely spoke of. "There was a time when I lost everything. My career felt hollow. Relationships crumbled and grief crushed me. I couldn't see a reason to keep going." His words hung in the air, heavy with shared pain. The man's grip on the railing loosened slightly. Keanu continued. "But someone reached out. They didn't have all the answers, but they listened. And slowly, I found my way back." Studies have shown the power of storytelling in moments of crisis. As Keanu spoke, he could see the man's breathing slow, his posture shift ever so slightly away from the edge. "It wasn't easy," Keanu admitted. "Some days I still struggle, but I learned to find meaning in the darkest moments." The man's voice, when it finally came, was rough with emotion. "How?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of countless sleepless nights. Keanu's response was gentle but firm. "One day at a time. Sometimes 1 hour at a time. I started small, finding one thing each day to be grateful for, no matter how tiny. It sounds cliché, but it became an anchor." He paused, letting the words sink in. The city lights glimmered below, a reminder of the world beyond this moment of crisis. "Your story isn't over," Keanu said softly. "There's still time to write new chapters, to find light even in the darkest places." The man's shoulders shook, tears cutting trails down his face. But for the first time, a ghost of something else flickered in his eyes. Not quite hope, but perhaps its faintest echo. "Maybe," the man whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Maybe I could try one more day." Keanu's heart soared, but he kept his voice calm and steady. "That's all we need," he said. "One day, and I'll be here, every step of the way." Hope flickered, fragile as a candle flame in a storm. But sometimes the darkest moment comes just before dawn. As the man teetered on the precipice, Keanu knew the next seconds would determine life or death. The air grew thick with tension, pressing down on them both. Keanu's muscles coiled, ready to spring into action if necessary. His eyes never left the man's face, searching for any sign of surrender or resolve. "I'm here," Keanu said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his insides. "You're not alone in this." The man's foot shifted, inching closer to the edge. Keanu's heart leapt into his throat. Was this it? Had all his words been for nothing? Tears streamed down the man's face, glistening in the dim light. He closed his eyes, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Keanu took a deep breath, steeling himself. He was about to take a risk, to lay bare a part of himself he rarely shared. But if it could save this man's life, it was worth it. "There was a time," Keanu began, his voice barely above a whisper, "when I thought I'd lost everything. My career was in shambles. Relationships crumbled around me. I stood where you're standing now, not on a bridge, but in my mind." The man's eyes flickered open, a hint of curiosity breaking through his anguish. "I felt hollow, empty. Like there was nothing left to live for, Keanu continued, his voice thick with emotion. But someone reached out to me. They didn't fix everything, but they reminded me that I wasn't alone, that my story wasn't over. Keanu took a cautious step forward, hand outstretched. Your story isn't over either. There are still chapters to be written, moments of joy to be experienced. It won't be easy, but you don't have to face it alone. The man turned, fully facing Keanu for the first time. His eyes, red-rimmed and haunted, locked onto Keanu's. In that gaze, Keanu saw a flicker of something. Not hope, not yet, but recognition, a spark of connection. Slowly, trembling, the man reached out. His fingers, cold and clammy, brushed against Keanu's. For a heartbeat, they stayed like that, connected by the thinnest of threads. Then, with a choked sob, the man grasped Keanu's hand. Keanu's grip tightened, firm but gentle, a lifeline forged in the crucible of this moment. The night's darkness began to fade, replaced by the soft glow of dawn. Keanu's muscles ached as he helped the trembling man over the railing. They collapsed onto the solid ground, both gasping for air. The immediate danger had passed, but Keanu knew this was only the beginning of a long journey. Beside him, the man shook uncontrollably. His eyes were wide, haunted by the weight of what almost happened. Keanu kept his arm around him, a steady anchor in the storm of emotions. The bridge loomed above them, a silent witness to the night's events. They sat in silence as the sky slowly transformed. Streaks of pink and gold chased away the inky black. Keanu's mind raced, knowing the next steps were crucial. He needed to get professional help here, fast. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached for his phone. The man flinched at the movement. Keanu squeezed his shoulder gently. "It's okay," he murmured. "I'm just making a call. I'm not going anywhere." His fingers shook slightly as he dialed. The conversation was brief, hushed. Help was on the way. Keanu's gaze never left the man beside him, watching for any signs of distress. As he hung up, the man's hoarse whisper broke the silence. "Thank you." The words were thick with exhaustion and raw emotion. Keanu's throat tightened. He squeezed the man's shoulder again. "Thank you for choosing to stay," he replied, his voice low and intense. The faint wail of sirens pierced the morning air. The man tensed, panic flashing across his face. Keanu leaned in, his eyes locked on the other man's. "They're here to help," he assured him. "You're not alone in this. Not anymore." The man's breathing steadied slightly. He looked at Keanu, really looked at him for the first time. His eyes were clear, the wild desperation of the night replaced by something fragile but unmistakable, hope. "I want to live," he whispered, the words barely audible above the approaching sirens. Keanu's heart clenched. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The bridge that had nearly been the site of tragedy now stood as a silent witness to this new beginning. The first rays of dawn painted the sky as Keanu watched the paramedics tend to the man. His heart still raced, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. He knew this night had changed them both forever. As the ambulance doors closed, Keanu felt a weight settle deep in his bones. The city around him stirred to life, oblivious to the battle for a soul that had unfolded on that lonely bridge. Keanu's mind raced with the gravity of what had transpired. Studies showed that interventions like this could reduce suicide rates by up to 20%, but numbers couldn't capture the raw emotion of the moment. He hoped the man would find the strength to seek help again if needed. As Keanu walked away, the bridge loomed behind him, no longer a sight of despair, but a testament to the power of human connection.